The sun beat down mercilessly on the vast territory of the Okavango Delta, creating a hypnotic dance of reflections on the tranquil waters. Orion Hayes drove his weathered jeep through the wild landscape, his experienced eyes constantly scanning the horizon. At 28, every inch of his sun-bronzed skin told a different story from his 15 years patrolling these lands. The scar cutting across his left forearm was a constant reminder of the respect nature demanded. The radio crackled with static. A scientific expedition had encountered problems during a sudden storm. Everyone was safe, but there had been confusion during the evacuation. Orion listened carefully to instructions from headquarters. His job was to check the area and ensure nothing had been left behind that might disturb the delicate balance of the ecosystem. "Understood. I'm on my way," he replied, turning the wheel to change direction. As he drove, his thoughts wandered to his father, Nicholas Hayes. It had been 16 years since he had passed away, also in service on these same wild lands. Sometimes Orion felt that each patrol brought him a little closer to his father's presence, as if he could see the world through the same eyes he had so admired in childhood. The sound interrupted his thoughts so abruptly that he almost lost control of the vehicle. A bark, desperate and shrill, cutting through the natural symphony of the savannah like a dissonant note in a perfect melody. "Guys, what the hell?" he muttered, slowing down. It was impossible. There were no domestic dogs in the middle of the delta, unless... The bark sounded again, weaker this time, but carrying an unmistakable tone of desperation that sent chills down Orion's spine. He stopped the jeep and grabbed his binoculars. For several minutes he scanned the horizon unsuccessfully until a subtle movement caught his attention. There it was, a small golden body trembling violently against the jagged rocks, and approaching slowly, with the lethal precision of a born predator, was a majestic male lion with a dark mane. Orion felt his heart race. The cornered animal was undeniably a Labrador, with a worn leather collar that reflected the sunlight. "Must be from the expedition," he whispered to himself, feeling the adrenaline rise. His trained mind calculated quickly. The protocol was clear: do not interfere with the natural course of wildlife. The lion was a predator in its habitat, acting according to its nature. But something in that Labrador's gaze, in the visible tremor of its exhausted body, broke through all the professional barriers Orion had built over the years. Without thinking twice, he started the engine and floored the accelerator. The jeep advanced with a mechanical roar, raising a cloud of red dust. Orion honked frantically, turned on his high beams, creating as much disturbance as possible. Time seemed to slow down as the lion turned its majestic head toward the vehicle, its amber eyes locking with Orion's in a silent challenge. For an eternal moment, man and predator sized each other up. The lion's deep roar vibrated in the air, a primordial display of power that made Orion's blood run cold. Years of training told him he was making a fatal mistake. Provoking a lion was practically a death sentence, but then the unthinkable happened. The lion hesitated, its posture shifting subtly, not from fear, but from something Orion could only describe as disconcerted curiosity. Taking advantage of those precious seconds, Orion leaped from the moving jeep and ran toward the Labrador. Each step was a challenge to every survival logic he had learned. The dog, sensing his approach, emitted a low whimper, its eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and an almost imperceptible spark of hope. "It's okay, boy. I'm going to get you out of here," murmured Orion, reaching the animal and lifting it in his arms. The Labrador was in deplorable condition, dehydrated with claw wounds, and so light it seemed unreal. As he ran back to the vehicle, Orion felt the lion's gaze burning into his back. As he jumped into the jeep, the predator's claws scraped against the metal, leaving deep marks that would serve as a permanent reminder of that moment. The engine roared, and the vehicle took off, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a momentarily confused lion. Orion drove for several miles before daring to slow down, his heart still hammering against his chest. Beside him, the Labrador had collapsed in exhaustion, breathing with difficulty. "You're a survivor, huh?" he said, observing the animal's collar. A small engraved metal tag was attached to it. "Let's see who you are." Orion cleaned the tag with his thumb and read the engraved name, Miracle. An involuntary smile formed on his lips. "Well, Miracle, you certainly lived up to your name today. Now let's take care of you." As he drove back to the station, Orion couldn't imagine that this impulsive rescue would be just the beginning of a story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the natural world. A man, a dog, and a lion, an impossible combination that was about to rewrite the rules of the wild. Orion's small cabin stood at the edge of the reserve, a simple structure of wood and stone that seemed more a part of the landscape than an alteration to it. It was his sanctuary, the place where he kept memories of his father and where now he fought to save Miracle's life. The Labrador trembled incessantly on the improvised table, while Orion cleaned his wounds with gentle though trembling hands. The gravity of the situation was evident: severe dehydration, deep claw wounds, and a state of shock that left the animal's eyes opaque, almost lifeless. "You'll be all right, boy," he murmured repeatedly, more to himself than to the dog. "You've already survived the impossible out there." His fingers worked methodically, applying antiseptic and improvised bandages. Years of watching veterinarians care for injured wild animals had given him basic knowledge, but Orion knew it wouldn't be enough if infection set in. What surprised Orion most, however, was the Labrador's reaction. Even in his debilitated state, Miracle raised his head with visible effort and licked Orion's hand as if he understood he was finally safe. "You really are special, aren't you?" Orion smiled, feeling an inexplicable connection forming between them. For the first 48 hours, Orion barely slept. Miracle's fever dangerously fluctuated, and every moment was crucial. He called the base by radio regularly, receiving guidance from Dr. Helena, the nearest veterinarian, who was 6 hours away. On the third night, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Miracle's fever spiked, and the infection spread visibly. Orion knew the basic antibiotics he had wouldn't be enough. "He's held on longer than we expected," said Dr. Helena's tired voice over the radio. "Yeah, but we need proper equipment. If you can bring him here." Orion didn't hesitate. He wrapped Miracle in blankets, carefully placed him on the passenger seat of his jeep, and set off into the night. The journey would be dangerous. Rivers overflowing with recent rains, virtually non-existent roads, and the constant threat of nocturnal predators. "Hang in there, Miracle," he whispered, accelerating the vehicle. "I promise I won't let you die, not after facing so much." The journey was brutal. Orion drove like never before, talking incessantly to Miracle, telling stories about the Delta, about his father, about the stars that shone brightly in the African sky. Sometimes the Labrador responded with small whimpers, as if he were really listening. "You know, my father used to say that all wildlife matters," Orion commented, avoiding a flooded area. He never distinguished between important and insignificant species. "I think he would have done the same for you." When they finally reached the veterinary clinic, at the first rays of sunlight, Orion was exhausted but determined. Dr. Helena, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and steady hands, received them immediately. "You made a crazy decision crossing the Delta at night," she reprimanded, but there was admiration in her voice. "I had no choice," he replied simply. The following hours were agonizing. Orion remained in the waiting room, watching the sunrise over the small town through the window. He thought about the lion, about how it had hesitated before attacking, something unusual for a predator of that size. There was something in that animal's eyes, an almost conscious intelligence that disturbed him. Finally, "Doctor." Helena appeared at the door, displaying a tired smile. "He's a fighter," she announced. "The infection has been controlled, and he's responding well to the antibiotics. With a few days of rest, I believe he'll recover completely." Orion felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Can I see him?" In the treatment room, Miracle was awake, his eyes now alert and bright. Upon seeing Orion, his tail began to wag weakly against the examination table. "He seems to know who saved him," commented Dr. Helena, observing the interaction. Orion approached, gently stroking the Labrador's head. "We are connected now, aren't we, boy?" During the following days, while Miracle recovered, Orion remained in town. He used the clinic's phone to contact the research base that had lost the dog. He discovered that Miracle belonged to Elliot Harrington, a renowned researcher who was conducting studies on migration patterns in the Delta. During the emergency evacuation due to the storm, Miracle had been frightened and fled into the bush. "Elliot is desperate to get him back," informed the base coordinator. "Cuz, he's temporarily in the field, but we can arrange for Miracle to be transported to the nearest city in a few weeks." Orion agreed, but felt an unexpected pang of reluctance. In just a few days, he had developed a deep bond with the Labrador. The idea of parting with him was surprisingly painful. When they finally received discharge, Orion carefully placed Miracle in the jeep. The Labrador, now visibly stronger, looked at him with eyes that seemed to understand much more than an animal should. "Let's go home, boy," said Orion, starting the engine. "Just for a few weeks, until your owner returns. But I'll make the most of every day." During the journey back, something strange happened. Miracle, who had been calm throughout the trip, suddenly rose, his ears on full alert. A low growl formed in his throat. Orion slowed down, his senses sharpened by years of patrol, detecting imminent danger. Slowly, rounding a curve in the dirt road, he saw it. The dark-maned lion was sitting calmly by the roadside as if waiting for them. "Impossible," murmured Orion, stopping the vehicle at a safe distance. What happened next defied everything Orion knew about animal behavior. Miracle, instead of panicking as would be expected, remained strangely calm. Alert, yes, but without the terror that any natural prey would show before its predator. The lion, in turn, showed no aggression. It remained seated, observing them with evident curiosity, its tail moving slowly in the dust. Orion and Miracle remained motionless in the vehicle, witnessing this surreal moment that seemed to suspend all laws of nature. After several minutes that felt like an eternity, the lion simply stood up and disappeared majestically into the dense vegetation. "Did you see that?" Orion asked rhetorically to the Labrador, who was now panting calmly at his side. "This isn't normal. None of this is normal." As they resumed their journey, Orion couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary was beginning to unfold in the wild lands of the Delta, something that defied explanation and that somehow had united the fate of three unlikely beings. The following weeks brought a new routine for Orion. Miracle, fully recovered, refused to stay alone in the cabin, entering a visible state of anxiety whenever Orion prepared to leave on patrol. After a few frustrated attempts to leave him behind, Orion gave in and began taking the Labrador on his daily rounds. "You really don't belong in this place," Orion would say as he drove, observing how the dog remained alert to every movement in the savannah. "But it seems you've adapted surprisingly well." It was true. Miracle demonstrated an extraordinary intuition for wildlife, often alerting Orion to the presence of animals before they could even be seen. His behavior had subtly changed, more alert, more attuned to the rhythms of nature, as if he were occupying a unique space between the domestic and wild worlds. Exactly 1 month after the rescue, it happened again. They were patrolling a remote area of the Delta when Miracle emitted a short, distinct bark. Orion immediately slowed down, his eyes scanning the horizon. There he was, the same dark-maned lion watching them from a nearby elevation. "It's him again," murmured Orion, instinctively reaching for the radio to call for backup. But something stopped him. The lion's behavior wasn't threatening, and more surprisingly, Miracle showed no fear. The Labrador was alert, his ears raised, but his posture was one of curiosity, not terror. Orion turned off the engine and grabbed his binoculars. For almost an hour they remained like this, the lion observing, man and dog returning the gaze, a strange atmosphere of mutual recognition hanging in the warm Delta air. "What's happening here?" Orion wondered, fascinated by the abnormality of the situation. In the following days, the phenomenon repeated itself. The lion began to follow their patrols at a distance, like a golden shadow always present on the horizon. Instead of feeling fear, Orion found himself looking forward to these encounters, intrigued by the predator's unusual behavior. In the third week, Orion made a discovery that left him speechless. When stopping at one of his usual spots to have lunch under the shade of an acacia tree, he found a freshly hunted gazelle, deliberately placed at the exact location where he usually parked his vehicle. "Is this a gift?" he asked aloud, incredulous. Miracle approached the carcass cautiously, sniffing it, then looked at Orion as if confirming his theory. A few meters away, partially hidden by vegetation, the lion's amber eyes gleamed, observing their reaction. Orion sat down slowly, trying to process what he was witnessing. In all his years of experience, in all the stories he had heard from older guards, there had never been a report of similar behavior. "It's as if he's trying to establish some kind of relationship," he murmured to himself. That night, Orion could barely sleep. His mind was buzzing with theories and possibilities. The next morning, he did something he knew went against all protocols. He called Dr. Fiona Holloway, an animal behavior specialist from the University of California, Berkeley, with whom he had worked years before. "Fiona, it's Orion Hayes from the Okavango Delta." he said as soon as she answered. I need you to come see something. Something that will challenge everything we know about predatory behavior. That sounds dramatically intriguing, she replied with evident skepticism in her voice. A lion is following my patrols, not to hunt, not to attack, to observe, and now he's leaving gifts. Like a house cat bringing prey to its owner. The silence on the other end of the line was eloquent. And there's more, continued Orion. He tried to attack a Labrador a few weeks ago. I intervened, saved the dog. Now, instead of fear, the dog shows recognition when the lion is nearby, as if they had some kind of understanding. Orion, Fiona's voice finally returned, now serious. Are you documenting this? I have some photos, but mostly observations in my field journal. Keep documenting. I'll be there next week. While waiting for the specialist's arrival, encounters with the lion became almost daily. Orion began to recognize patterns in his behavior, how the predator always maintained a specific distance, how his gaze frequently alternated between Orion and Miracle, how he seemed especially present when they were in more remote areas of the delta. One afternoon, Orion decided to try something. He stopped the jeep in an open clearing where he would be completely exposed. He took a piece of dried meat from his backpack, placed it on the hood of the vehicle, and then stepped back a few paces with Miracle at his side. Let's see what happens, he murmured, his heart racing. For almost 2 hours, nothing happened. Orion was about to give up when he noticed the subtle movement in the vegetation. The lion was slowly emerging, each step calculated, his eyes fixed on theirs. Miracle emitted a soft sound, not a bark or a growl, but something in between, a sound that Orion had never heard before. The lion advanced to the vehicle, his powerful muscles rippling beneath the golden fur. With incredible delicacy for such a large creature, he took the dried meat and retreated a few steps, then sat down and ate, without breaking eye contact. This is unbelievable, whispered Orion, slowly raising his camera to capture the moment. The click of the shutter didn't disturb the lion. When he finished his meal, the great feline remained seated for several minutes, as if contemplating the situation as much as Orion was. Then, with the same majestic calm with which he had arrived, he disappeared again into the savannah. That night, reviewing the photos, Orion noticed something that had escaped his attention. In the images, he could clearly see that the lion had a distinctive scar crossing his right eye, a mark that made it impossible to confuse him with any other. You carry your stories too, he murmured, observing the image. What happened to you? What made you so different? When Fiona finally arrived a week later, Orion had already compiled a detailed diary of observations, dozens of photographs, and even a map marking all the locations of encounters with the lion, which he now called Scar, due to the distinctive mark. Would I want to make it clear that I'm extremely skeptical about this, declared Fiona, as she examined the materials in his cabin. Atypical behaviors can be explained by numerous factors: disease, neurological trauma, previous exposure to humans. See for yourself, replied Orion. By tomorrow we'll patrol the area where encounters are most frequent. The next day dawned with perfect clarity, the kind of day wildlife photographers dream of capturing. Orion, Fiona, and Miracle set out early, the Labrador sitting alertly between them in the jeep. He seems anxious, observed Fiona, noticing how Miracle constantly sniffed the air. He always gets like this when he knows Scar is nearby, explained Orion. It's as if he can somehow sense his presence. Fiona raised a skeptical eyebrow, but didn't comment. After 2 hours of patrolling unsuccessfully, Orion began to feel frustrated. Would Scar choose today of all days not to appear? Not to. It was then that Miracle emitted his characteristic bark, that particular sound that Orion now recognized as the Scar alert. Following the direction indicated by the Labrador, they spotted the lion majestically lying on a distant rock, his dark mane contrasting with the blue sky. Orion watched Fiona's expression transform from skepticism to absolute amazement, when Miracle, instead of showing fear, began wagging his tail as he would upon meeting a canine friend. This isn't possible, she murmured, grabbing her binoculars. Watch what happens now, said Orion, turning off the engine. In the following minutes, a scene that defied all known laws of nature unfolded before them. The lion slowly descended from the rock and approached to a distance of approximately 30 meters, close enough to attack if he wished, but maintaining a respectful distance. Miracle emitted another sound, softer this time, The lion responded with an almost imperceptible head movement. "Are they communicating?" Fiona's voice was almost a whisper. "In some way, yes," confirmed Orion, "and this has been happening for weeks." For almost an hour they remained like this, observing and being observed, a silent exchange of recognition that transcended the barriers between species. When Scar finally retreated and disappeared among the trees, Fiona was visibly shaken. "In 20 years studying animal behavior, I've never seen anything remotely like this," she admitted. "We need to document this properly. This could rewrite what we know about predatory cognition and interspecies bond formation." In the following days, Fiona set up filming equipment at strategic points. Each encounter with Scar was meticulously documented, analyzed, discussed. The scientists' initial reluctance had transformed into almost feverish enthusiasm. "The most fascinating thing," she explained one night as they reviewed the footage, "isn't just the lion's non-aggressive behavior, but how he seems to have developed a specific communication system with you two, that particular bark that Miracle emits. I've never heard anything similar in other dogs. It's as if they've created their own language." Orion smiled, stroking Miracle's head, who was sleeping peacefully at his feet. "It seems we've formed quite an unlikely trio." "Unlikely is an understatement," laughed Fiona. "I'd say impossible. The impossible trio." The name caught on immediately. In the following weeks, as news of the phenomenon began to spread among the local scientific community, that's how they referred to them. The impossible trio. A man, a dog, and a lion, defying millions of years of instinct to form a connection that no one had ever imagined possible. Heavy clouds gathered on the horizon, making the air dense and electric. Orion watched the restless sky as he prepared the jeep for the day's patrol. The rainy season had arrived with force, transforming parts of the delta into aquatic labyrinths dangerous to navigate. "Looks like it's going to be a complicated day, Miracle," he commented, checking his emergency equipment. The Labrador, now fully adapted to the patrol routine, jumped enthusiastically onto the passenger seat. 2 months had passed since the rescue, and the date to return Miracle to his original owner was approaching. Orion tried not to think about it, but the idea of parting with the dog caused him an almost tangible physical pain. The radio crackled with static before the voice of the reserve coordinator sounded. "Hayes, we have a situation in the southern area. Last night's storm knocked down several trees, and there are reports of animals trapped in an area that's rapidly flooding. Can you check it out?" "On my way," replied Orion, putting the jeep in motion. The journey was difficult, with the terrain transformed by the intense rain. Several times Orion had to deviate from usual paths, navigating alternative routes. Miracle remained alert at his side, occasionally emitting small, anxious barks when the vehicle dangerously swayed over the irregular terrain. As they approached the southern area, the devastation became evident. Century-old trees lay uprooted, and vast stretches of savanna had transformed into improvised lakes. Orion drove slowly, his trained eyes looking for signs of animals in danger. It was Miracle who first detected something, a sharp bark followed by unusual agitated behavior. Orion stopped the vehicle, trying to interpret what the dog was perceiving. "What is it, boy? What are you sensing?" The Labrador fixed his gaze in a specific direction, a small plateau in the distance that was becoming an island amid the rising waters. Orion grabbed his binoculars and scanned the indicated area. "My God," he murmured upon identifying what was happening. A small group of gazelles was cornered on the elevation, surrounded by waters that continued to rise. But that wasn't what made Orion's heart race. It was the majestic figure also trapped with them, Scar. The lion was in a strange position. Instead of taking advantage of the situation to hunt the cornered gazelles, he seemed equally disoriented, seeking an escape route that no longer existed. The waters continued to rise rapidly, threatening to completely submerge the small island of dry land. "We need to do something," Orion said to Miracle, whose eyes remained fixed on the distant scene. He radioed headquarters, explaining the situation. The response was immediate and firm. "Hayes, your priority is evacuating any endangered species. The lion is a strong swimmer, it can fend for itself. Focus on the gazelles." Orion acknowledged the orders, but an unsettling feeling gnawed at him. The way Scar was behaving wasn't normal. The lion paced nervously, avoiding water in a way that suggested fear. "He's afraid of the water," realized Orion suddenly. That's why he's not swimming to safety. Making a decision that could cost him his job, Orion drove as close as possible to the flooded area. The water was already too deep for the jeep, but he spotted a small aluminum boat that locals used for fishing, tied to a nearby tree. "Miracle, stay," he ordered firmly, jumping out of the vehicle. The Labrador whimpered, but obeyed. Orion waded through knee-deep water to reach the boat, untied it and pushed it into the water. Using a long pole he found inside, he began navigating toward the improvised island. The gazelles, seeing the approaching boat, leaped desperately into the water, instinctively swimming away from their natural predator, despite the danger of the currents. Orion let them go; they would reach safe ground on their own. As he approached the island, Scar fixed his amber gaze on him. There was no aggression in those eyes, but an unmistakable desperation. The lion was indeed terrified of the water, which was now lapping at his paws. "I can't believe I'm doing this," muttered Orion, as he maneuvered the boat directly onto the small island, now barely large enough for Scar to stand on. From the jeep, Miracle barked frantically, as if understanding the danger his human was putting himself in. Orion extended the pole toward the lion, not knowing what else to do. To his astonishment, Scar approached cautiously, sniffing the pole without aggression. "Come on, big guy," encouraged Orion, keeping his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "Jack, you have to trust me." What happened next would later be described by Fiona as the most extraordinary interspecies cooperation ever documented. The lion, after a moment of hesitation, leaped into the boat with an agility that belied his size. The small craft rocked violently, threatening to capsize, but somehow remained upright. Orion found himself in a surreal situation, alone in a small boat with a fully grown male lion, separated by less than 6 feet. Scar settled in the bow, his eyes fixed on Orion's, in what could only be described as a silent acknowledgement. With trembling hands but steady nerves, Orion began poling the boat back towards solid ground. Miracle's barking grew more excited as they approached. When they finally reached the shore, Scar leaped out immediately, shaking water from his mane. Instead of disappearing into the savannah, however, he stopped at a short distance and turned to look at Orion, a long, penetrating stare that seemed to contain a depth of understanding no wild animal should possess. Then, in a gesture that left Orion breathless, the lion lowered his head slightly, in what appeared to be a nod, before finally turning away and disappearing into the landscape. Miracle rushed to Orion, jumping excitedly around him, licking his hands and whimpering with relief. Orion knelt, embracing the Labrador, still trying to process what had just happened. "He knew," whispered Orion. "He understood that I was helping him." That night, as Orion recounted the events to Fiona over the radio, her initial response was skeptical disbelief. But when he sent her the photos from his camera, particularly the image of Scar staring at him from the boat, the majestic predator willingly placing himself in a position of vulnerability, her tone changed radically. "Orion, this goes beyond anything we've documented," she said, her voice filled with academic excitement. "This is potential evidence of cross-species reciprocity and emotional recognition in a wild predator. It's revolutionary." In the following days, news of the rescue spread through the reserve like wildfire. Local guides began calling them the Impossible Trio, and stories of their unusual bond traveled far beyond the borders of the Delta. What neither Orion nor Fiona could have anticipated was how quickly these stories would transform into something larger than themselves, or how soon their extraordinary bond would be put to an even more dramatic test. The news traveled faster than anyone could have imagined. What began as hushed stories among local guides exploded into international attention when Fiona published preliminary findings in a prestigious scientific journal. Almost overnight, the Okavango Delta was flooded not just with seasonal rains, but with wildlife photographers, documentary crews, and scientists eager to witness the phenomenon firsthand. Orion found the sudden attention disorienting. His simple life of solitary patrols had transformed into carefully scheduled demonstrations and endless interviews. The only constant was Miracle's steady presence at his side, the Labrador handling the attention with surprising grace. "I'm not sure how much longer I can deal with this circus," confessed Orion to Fiona one evening as they sat outside his cabin, watching the sunset. The research camp she had established nearby buzzed with activity even at this late hour. "The scientific importance can't be overstated," she replied, reviewing data on her tablet. We're documenting behavior that fundamentally challenges our understanding of interspecies relationships. The implications for conservation psychology alone. I know, interrupted Orion, but I didn't save Miracle for science, and Scar isn't some laboratory specimen, they're family now. The word hung in the air, surprising even Orion himself, yet it felt right. In the 3 months since the rescue, the bond between the three of them had only deepened. Scar now regularly appeared during patrols, sometimes even lounging visibly near Orion's cabin at night, a golden sentinel in the darkness. Even more remarkably, Miracle had developed a distinctive vocalization specifically for Scar's presence. Not a warning bark, but a melodic sound somewhere between a whine and a purr that seemed to serve as greeting. The lion, in turn, would acknowledge them with a slow blink that ethologists were now calling a trust signal. "I understand your frustration," said Fiona softly. But consider what's happening here. In a world increasingly separated from nature, your story is reconnecting people with the possibility of harmony. That's worth something, isn't it?" Before Orion could respond, his radio crackled with the voice of the reserve's director, Thomas Kruger. "Hayes, my office, first thing tomorrow. The situation is getting out of hand." The following morning, Orion drove to headquarters with Miracle beside him, anxiety churning in his stomach. The reserve's director was a pragmatic man who prioritized conservation protocols above all else. The attention surrounding the impossible trio had clearly stretched those protocols to breaking point. "The board is concerned," began Kruger without preamble, his weathered face stern as Orion settled into the chair across from his desk. Miracle sat obediently at Orion's feet. "Tourism has doubled. That means more vehicles, more disturbance, more stress on the ecosystem. And the scientific teams aren't much better, competing for observation time, arguing over methodologies." "I understand, sir, but—" "I'm not finished," interrupted Kruger, leaning forward. "Then there's the matter of the lion. We're witnessing unprecedented habituation to human presence. If anything goes wrong, if anyone gets hurt, the consequences would be catastrophic. We'd be legally obligated to eliminate the threat." The thought of Scar being hunted sent a cold wave through Orion's body. He's shown no aggression, not once in 3 months. That's not the point. And then there's this. Kruger slid a document across the desk. "Elliot Harrington is returning next week. He wants his dog back." Orion stared at the paper, feeling as though the ground had disappeared beneath him. He'd known this day was coming, but somehow had pushed it from his mind, allowing himself to imagine that Miracle would remain with him indefinitely. "Miracle is bonded to me now," he said, his voice strained. "And to Scar. Breaking that bond could be dangerous for everyone involved." Kruger's expression softened slightly. "I understand your attachment, Hayes, but legally, the dog belongs to Harrington. As for the lion, the board is recommending we tranquilize and relocate him to the northern sector. It's 100 miles away, far enough to break this unusual pattern before someone gets hurt." Orion left the meeting in a daze, his mind racing. The thought of losing both Miracle and Scar was unbearable. Back at his cabin, he found Fiona waiting with unexpected news of her own. "National Geographic called," she announced excitedly. "Oh, they want to fund a dedicated research preserve, specifically for studying interspecies bonds like the one you've established. It would be a controlled environment, limited access, pure research focus." "Where?" asked Orion, barely daring to hope. "That's the best part. They're prepared to purchase private land adjacent to the eastern boundary of the reserve, technically outside Kruger's jurisdiction, but still within the Delta ecosystem." For the first time that day, Orion felt a flicker of hope. "And Miracle?" Fiona hesitated. "That's more complicated. I've spoken with Harrington by phone. He's invested in this dog. Had him since he was a puppy." Orion gazed out the window, where the afternoon light painted the savannah in gold. Somewhere out there, Scar was roaming, unaware that his world was about to change. "I need to meet with Harrington," Orion said finally, face to face. "Maybe if he sees the bond Miracle has formed, if he witnesses the trio in action." "It's worth trying," agreed Fiona. "In the meantime, I'll push forward with the sanctuary proposal. If we can secure that, at least we have options." The week passed in a blur of anxiety and preparation. Orion documented every interaction with Scar, filmed Miracle's unique vocalizations, and gathered everything that might convince Harrington of the extraordinary nature of what had developed. The day before Harrington's scheduled arrival, Miracle led them to an unexpected discovery. During their morning patrol, the Labrador became unusually excited, leading Orion off their usual path and into a secluded valley that he rarely patrolled. "What is it, boy? What are you showing me?" Orion asked as they followed on foot, leaving the jeep behind. The answer emerged as they rounded a cluster of acacia trees. There, hidden within a natural depression in the earth, lay Scar, and beside him 3 small cubs, no more than a few weeks old. "My God," whispered Orion, freezing in place. "He's not a male. Scar is a female." Everything suddenly made sense. The protective behavior, the gift-bringing, the unusual bond with Miracle. Scar wasn't just any lion. She was a mother seeking allies to help protect her vulnerable family. Scar raised her head, acknowledging their presence without alarm. One of the cubs stumbled toward them on unsteady legs, curious about the newcomers. Miracle whined softly, dropping to his belly in a non-threatening posture. "This changes everything," Orion realized. A lioness with cubs is classified as priority conservation status. They can't relocate her now. He carefully documented the den site without approaching too closely, then retreated with Miracle. His mind was racing with this new information and what it meant for their future. When Elliot Harrington arrived the next morning, he wasn't what Orion had expected. Rather than the stern academic he'd imagined, Harrington was a slight man in his 50s, with kind eyes and a soft-spoken manner. The moment Miracle saw him, the Labrador's reaction was complex. Recognition and affection, certainly, but also hesitation, with frequent glances back at Orion. "He looks well," said Harrington, kneeling to greet his dog. "Better than well. You've taken good care of him." "He's special," replied Orion carefully. "More than you know." Over the next few hours, Orion explained everything. The rescue, the developing bond with Scar, the discovery of the cubs, and the international attention their relationship had garnered. Harrington listened intently, his scientific curiosity clearly piqued. "I'd like to see it for myself," he said finally. "This interaction you've described, it sounds extraordinary." That afternoon, they drove to a location where Scar had frequently been spotted. Miracle sat between the 2 men, occasionally nuzzling both, as if trying to reconcile his 2 worlds. "You understand I've had him since he was 8 weeks old," said Harrington as they waited. "We've been through a lot together. When I thought I'd lost him in the evacuation..." His voice trailed off, emotion evident. "I understand," said Orion quietly. "But I'm asking you to consider what he's become part of here. Something unprecedented. Something important." Before Harrington could respond, Miracle's ears perked up. He emitted the distinctive vocalization that Orion had come to recognize, the Scar call. Both men fell silent as the lioness emerged from the tall grass, cautious but deliberate. What followed was a silent demonstration, more powerful than any words Orion could have offered. They watched as Miracle approached Scar with confident familiarity, the huge predator greeting the dog with gentle head bumps. For nearly an hour, the 2 animals engaged in what could only be described as social interaction, while the humans observed in stunned silence. When they finally drove back to the camp as sunset approached, Harrington was quiet for a long time. "I've studied animal behavior for 30 years, he said finally. "Nothing in my experience prepared me for what I just witnessed." He glanced at Miracle, who had fallen asleep between them, exhausted from the day's emotions. "He's not just my pet anymore, is he? He's become something else entirely, part of something larger." "Yes," Orion said simply. That evening, as they shared a meal outside Orion's cabin under a canopy of stars, Harrington made his decision. "I can't separate him from this," he said, watching Miracle dozing nearby. "It would be selfish and scientifically irresponsible, but I can't simply give him up either." He took a deep breath. "What if I joined Fiona's research team? I have sabbatical time available. I could stay, study this phenomenon properly, and still be part of Miracle's life." Relief washed over Orion. "I think that would be perfect." The following day brought another piece of good news. The National Geographic funding had been approved. The sanctuary would become a reality, offering a controlled space where the impossible trio could continue their extraordinary relationship away from excessive tourism or interference. When they shared the news of Scar's cubs and Harrington's decision with the reserve board, even Director Kruger had to acknowledge that the situation had evolved beyond conventional protocols. "We'll establish clear guidelines," he conceded. "Limited observation groups, proper distancing, priority given to research over tourism." If this is to continue, it will be on terms that protect all involved, including the lions. As Orion, Miracle, and Harrington walked away from the meeting, Fiona joined them with excitement radiating from her face. "The scientific community is calling it a paradigm shift," she announced. "The implications for conservation psychology, predator-prey dynamics, even theories of animal consciousness, it's opening doors we didn't even know existed." Orion smiled, but his thoughts were simpler, less academic. He was thinking of a frightened Labrador trembling against jagged rocks, of amber eyes that held intelligence no textbook had prepared him for, and of the impossible connection that had formed against all odds. That evening, they visited Scar's den together, Orion, Harrington, Fiona, and Miracle, maintaining a respectful distance. The lioness appeared briefly, acknowledging their presence with that now familiar slow blink, before disappearing back into the shelter to tend her cubs. "My father used to say that every life in the wild matters," Orion said quietly, "but he never told me that sometimes those lives become intertwined in ways that change everything." 6 months later, the Okavango Delta Research Sanctuary stood completed, a modest collection of environmentally integrated structures nestled at the eastern edge of the reserve. Unlike typical research stations, this one had been designed with a singular purpose: to study, document, and protect the extraordinary relationship that had developed between species that should, by all natural laws, remain forever divided by the predator-prey boundary. Orion stood on the observation deck, watching the 3 lion cubs, now half-grown, tumbling playfully in the morning sun. Their mother, Scar, lounged nearby, her distinctive facial marking catching the light. At the edge of the clearing, Miracle sat attentively, his posture relaxed yet watchful, the unofficial guardian of this unconventional family. "Still hard to believe, isn't it?" said Elliot Harrington, joining him at the railing. In the month since his arrival, Harrington had transformed from potential adversary to valued colleague and friend. His expertise in animal cognition had brought new dimensions to their understanding of what was unfolding before them. "Every day," agreed Orion. "And yet every day it also feels more natural somehow." The sanctuary had quickly become a hub of scientific breakthrough. Researchers from around the world rotated through, each bringing specialized knowledge to help document and interpret the phenomenon. Cameras monitored the interactions around the clock, capturing behaviors never before seen in wild predators. Most remarkably, the relationship continued to evolve. The lion cubs, having known Miracle's presence since birth, treated the Labrador with a familiarity that defied explanation. They would approach him with the same playful solicitation they showed their mother, while recognizing boundaries that kept rough play in check. Miracle, for his part, had developed an astonishing repertoire of vocalizations, distinct sounds for different cubs, warning noises when other predators approached, and the special greeting reserved only for Scar. Orion and Miracle still conducted their patrols, but now with a new purpose: monitoring the expanding territory of Scar's pride, while documenting every new development in their unique social structure. "The BBC team arrives tomorrow," reminded Harrington, checking his tablet. "And Dr. Anne Como from Johannesburg wants to begin the comparative cognitive testing next week." Orion nodded, though his thoughts were less on the research schedule and more on the unexpected journey that had brought them here. His impulsive rescue of a terrified dog had rippled outward, challenging fundamental assumptions about animal behavior and interspecies relationships. "I had a call from the Conservation Minister yesterday," continued Harrington. "The educational program based on the trio has now reached over 2,000 schools nationwide. Children are writing stories, making art, learning about conservation through their story. It's quite something." The educational impact had been perhaps the most surprising outcome. What began as scientific curiosity had transformed into a powerful narrative that captured imaginations globally. The Impossible Trio had become ambassadors for a new way of thinking about wildlife, not as separate categories of predator and prey, human and animal, but as a complex, interconnected web of relationships with untapped potential for harmony. That afternoon, they hosted a small ceremony marking the sanctuary's 6-month anniversary. Local community leaders, conservation officials, and key researchers gathered under the open-air pavilion. As Director Kruger, now a passionate supporter of the project, addressed the group, Orion slipped away quietly. He walked to the edge of the compound, where a simple memorial stone had been placed beneath an acacia tree. It was dedicated to his father, Nicholas Hayes, whose philosophy that every life in the wild matters had unconsciously guided Orion's fateful decision that day. Miracle padded silently alongside him, ever his companion. "You would have loved this, Dad," Orion said softly, placing his hand on the sun-warmed stone. A distinctive sound made both Orion and Miracle turn. At the edge of the clearing stood Scar, watching them with those intelligent amber eyes. Without fear or hesitation, she approached, her powerful presence a reminder of nature's majesty. She stopped a few feet away, regarding them both before settling into the grass, her posture relaxed and trusting. For several minutes, the three of them remained there in comfortable silence, man, dog, and lion, the original impossible trio whose connection had rewritten scientific understanding and touched hearts worldwide. The moment was interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps. Fiona appeared, camera in hand, her expression apologetic. "Sorry to intrude," she said, keeping her voice low, "but I thought you might want this moment documented." Orion smiled. "Some things can't really be captured on film, Fiona. But yes, go ahead." As she recorded the scene, Fiona asked, "For the archive, Orion, looking back now, what would you say is the most important lesson from all of this?" Orion considered the question carefully, watching as Miracle moved slightly closer to Scar, the two animals acknowledging each other with a familiarity that once would have seemed impossible. "I think," he said finally, "it's that the boundaries we believe are fixed by nature are sometimes just boundaries of imagination, that compassion can build bridges where we thought only walls could exist." He paused, remembering the desperate barking that had first drawn him to a terrified Labrador months ago, and that sometimes the most important scientific breakthroughs begin not with a hypothesis, but with a simple act of kindness. In the distance, the lion cubs appeared, cautiously approaching under their mother's watchful eye. One by one, they settled near the unusual gathering, the expanding circle of the impossible trio. That night, as the stars emerged above the delta, Orion sat outside his cabin with Miracle beside him. Tomorrow would bring more researchers, more questions, more documentation. The story of the impossible trio would continue to spread, inspiring conservation efforts and challenging preconceptions around the world. But for now, in this quiet moment, Orion simply appreciated the extraordinary chain of events that a single choice had set in motion. Somewhere in the darkness, Scar and her growing cubs were safe, protected, and part of something unprecedented, a new kind of family that transcended the ancient divisions of the natural world. As if reading his thoughts, Miracle placed his head on Orion's knee, those soulful eyes looking up with understanding that went beyond words. Orion smiled, scratching behind the Labrador's ears. "We did good, didn't we, boy?" he whispered. In the distance, a lion's roar echoed across the delta, not threatening but affirming, as if in agreement. The impossible had become possible. And in that transformation lay hope not just for the wild places of the world, but for all those who sought connection across the boundaries that divide us. My friends, we've come to the end of the story. Did you like it? What lesson can you bring to life from this story? Leave it here in the comments. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video that's playing on your screen. This story will impact you. See you next time.